Okay, hi, my name is Julia Mulder. I'm a teacher of the deaf and hard of hearing. This year I'm actually placed in a hearing center, so I'm full-time in a high school where I support students with hearing loss, with their needs. Day to day what I do is I ensure that they're getting all the information they need. So whether it's the announcements where I type them so they have access to them right to their phone, note taking in the classroom if they're in their classes, providing accommodations so they might get extra time for tests. So I'm in the hearing center, pre and post teaching of teachers' lessons just to make sure the students have received all the information and understand the language. In the past I've taught as young as 2 years of age all the way up to grade 12. And I think I've covered all the age ranges for kids with hearing loss. Yeah, I learn from my students every day. I think it depends on the different levels, age levels that I'm talking about. Each student with hearing loss is very different, and I do tell that to my students when I work with them. There's not one student I work with that is the same. Their type of hearing loss, to their communication mode, to the age of when they access language, makes them a very different and unique individual. I learn from them, from their experiences. They share a lot of stories with me, and I love what I do. I've always wanted to be a teacher. Since grade 3 I decided I was going to be a teacher, and I knew I was going to teach a special education field. So some sort of disabilities. My mom was a former teacher of special education, so that was my world, and going to her schools and classes, I knew that that's what I wanted to fit into. After Teachers College, I worked at a private school for kids with learning disabilities, and one of the students in that class actually had a hearing loss, a unilateral loss, so they wore hearing aid on 1 ear. That student got highly distracted by the people behind him and would turn around, and I didn't really understand why, and I didn't understand about the hearing aid. So that was one reason I decided to get into the deaf and hard of hearing program. Another thing was I took American Sign Language for 3 years in university, and my professors there introduced me to the deaf culture and sign language, and they talked about American Sign Language and the deaf and hard of hearing program. So I decided after getting into teaching, you know what, maybe that's what I want to do. And I've been doing it ever since. I think it's pretty amazing because teaching the deaf and hard of hearing, you don't just meet your student for a year and then leave them. A lot of these kids you've been paired up with for 3, 4, 5 years, and then you continue your connection much later on, so you can kind of find out what's happened to them and what's going on. So a lot of these kids, right now actually, I first met the students I work with now 12 years ago when I first started in this field, and now I'm working with them today. I've seen them where they started with their first initial amplification, whether it be their first cochlear implant surgery, learning the language, adapting to their hearing world. I've worked with students who just started learning sign and now they're proficient signers. So to see that growth, also self-esteem wise, really accepting their hearing loss and feeling confident walking into a room and saying, listen, I have a hearing loss, this is what I need. They become very successful adults, and I'm really proud of them.
You were speaking about their self-esteem. Mm-hmm. Can you dive into that a little bit? Kind of walk me through the self-esteem and the emotional process of some of the things that your students go through.
Okay, as mainstream education has become the main option for the students actually where I work right now, I will encounter students who are the only one with hearing loss in their school. Sometimes it can be challenging for these students because there are a lot of questions that come with it from hearing peers. So really just giving them that self-esteem and that confidence to explain why they have a hearing loss, why they are wearing hearing aids or a cochlear implant or whatever. When they're younger, it's not a big deal, and they're very comfortable with it. But as they get through the teenage years, sometimes the kids can be not so nice, and they're maybe teasing or questioning where they feel embarrassed about it. So it's really important to explain the benefits, give them the confidence, connect them with other people with hearing loss. They know they're not the only one who's going through the same thing. So by the time they graduate from school, they're very comfortable with who they are. And I think it's really important for them to be comfortable and embrace their hearing loss right from the beginning. Okay, when I went abroad to teach, the one thing I noticed, right here we had the luxury of having audiologists and Sick Kids Hospital right there. So if there's something that goes wrong with equipment, you have people to fix it. If there's an issue with your hearing aid, cochlear implant, FM system, away, they have to send it to the States. So there's a 2-3 week delay. If you need to get remapped with your cochlear implant, you have to fly abroad. So having that access right here, living in Toronto, you have access to sick kids, is really fantastic. I think we can do a lot more in terms of supporting deaf and hard of hearing people in the community. Things like closed captioning. Right now when I am watching movies and stuff like that, not all movies are closed captioned, and if they are, sometimes the caption doesn't match the words. I think also if you're in public buildings and there's announcements, it would be really nice to have some kind of print, especially on public transportation, things like that. We do have Braille around the system. We do have sounds for if they're pushing the button to cross for the blind. I'd like to see a bit more with deaf and hard of hearing. I think it's also important just to have the awareness of what it means to be hard of hearing. There's different levels of deafness. Just because you have a hearing loss does not mean you're a fluent signer. And also, just because you have a cochlear implant does not mean that that replaces your hearing so you have perfect hearing. A lot of people assume that with a cochlear implant that the kids are hearing just as equivalent as someone who can't see wears glasses. With a cochlear implant, the students still have to work hard to hear what they're hearing in their environment. So I think it's important to be aware of that. Repeat when a student asks what's asking her. So if you encounter a deaf person, not just a student, face them. Be aware of your environment. If there's some noise in the background and stuff like that, you might want to move somewhere quiet. So things like that awareness that just because they have a cochlear implant doesn't mean that they're hearing the same as you and I do.